the end of my first week when it was at the 2019 Preparedness Conference. So I got to kick off my career with that. My background, I graduated from Endicott College with my master's degree in Homeland Security Studies shortly before joining the Homeland Security Unit in Vermont Emergency Management. A lot of my research in that focused on sort of asymmetric threats to the country, including things like economic espionage and intellectual property theft. And as Emily mentioned, I do oversee the infrastructure program for the state, where we are working to better protect and improve resilience for our infrastructure assets within the state. Before we begin and before I really hop in, I do just want to give thanks to a few people. First of all, to everyone on the call. Thank you. I think that, these few months have been pretty crazy times for everybody, and you are all working diligently, whether a small effort or a large effort, to keep people safe. And I think that's really important given this trying time. I want to extend my thanks to Rich, Emily, and the rest of the planning team for the conference, especially Brittany, who worked very closely with me to get a run through going, a practice run going through. I was having some computer problems at the end of last week and the beginning of this week, and she was very happy to move back our meetings a couple of times. So a special thank you to her. So what I will be covering. So first, I'm going to start out with just providing an overview of what is critical infrastructure. We'll kind of review and walk through each of the 16 sectors, take a little bit deeper of a dive into them, look at some of the dependencies and interdependencies, and some of the risks that these sectors face individually. From there, we're going to hop in and look at some small, I call them case studies, but sort of past events and some lessons that we can learn from those past events that we can still apply to today. And then finally, we'll kind of wrap up with looking at what some of the future threats may be for the critical infrastructure industry, and I'll hopefully provide some resources and some key takeaways, as I said, that hopefully you can bring back to your community to begin implementing. So hopping in. So critical infrastructure, what is it? That's always the $25,000 question, right? And it's something that I think is becoming more and more of a hot topic as time goes on. As threats and hazards begin to change, we're beginning to see more of a focus on critical infrastructure, I think, nationwide. So the Department of Homeland Security is the definition that they use. It's what you see on screen. I won't read it for you. I will read parts of it, but it's on the screen. Hopefully you can read it yourself. But some things I do want to point out in this is kind of the first part. So the systems and assets, whether physical or virtual. And the important thing here to think about is the physical or virtual part of this. So I think it's clear that a lot of people can go out, on a nice stroll and see a dam and think that, that is clearly a dam, that is a physical object, that is a no-brainer. It is infrastructure and an important part of it. But as time has gone on, technology is continuing to expand. We've seen more assets become sort of virtual. And it's important when thinking about the security and protection of these infrastructure assets that we are considering all of them, even things that we can't necessarily see every day. And then the second part I'll point out in this definition, and I think this is important, is when we're talking about critical infrastructure protection, what we're really focused on is risk management. And I think that this is a perfect kind of segue from the previous two presentations, where we kind of talked about kind of planning for different threats and hazards when it comes to special events, and then specifically talking about some of those natural hazards and what they may be. But when it comes to critical infrastructure, per this definition, what we really want to focus on is the impacts of security, national economic security, and national public health or safety. These are kind of the three factors we look at with if something happens to an infrastructure asset, how is it going to impact the security of the nation, the economics, how many jobs does it create, what does it contribute to exports, imports, whatever it may be, and what's ultimately going to be that safety and national public health. Are people going to get sick because something happened, or is it going to be far worse and we're going to see people dying from what may happen? So I think that those are the key points kind of looking at this definition, and it's very specific and but vague at the same time, and it's a definition that I think will probably continually change. It's one of those things that I don't think is always set in stone, but as time goes on and again, technology expands, this definition may change as well, but this is what we go with for now. So looking at the critical infrastructure sector. So again, this is something where we talk about things changing. This is something that has changed through time. There used to be 18 and things have been adopted, things have been removed, added in, but now we're looking at 16 critical infrastructure sectors, which you can see on the screen now. In the following slides, I'm going to go through each one a little bit more in depth and hopefully provide sort of that high-level overview for you, but to be able to understand what these sectors are, what we're really looking for, and some of the risks associated. So we'll start with the communications sector. So the communications sector is a sector which we consider a lifeline sector. So there are 4 lifeline sectors, communications being the first one that we'll cover. Lifeline sectors are kind of those that are really that backbone of our society. Nations or our nation relies on these sectors to really promote all those aspects of security, economic security, and public health and safety. And for the most part, all other sectors rely on these 4 sectors to kind of do their job. And we'll cover that a little bit more as we go along into the other sectors. But just to provide you an overview of the country snapshot of this. So in 2014, the communications sector contributed 3.5 million jobs within our society and roughly $1 trillion to U.S. gross domestic product, which is about 7% of our U.S. economy. So obviously, it's a very expansive sector and clearly a very important one when we're thinking about those 3 factors that we talked about earlier. Major risks include natural disasters and extreme weather, which of course we talked about in the last presentation. Obviously, those aspects will potentially affect the communications sector when it comes to high winds or larger storms of hurricanes or flooding. Supply chain is a big component of this, and we're going to touch upon supply chain a little later, so I won't get too in depth to this, but there is a big component and major risk of supply chain when it comes to this sector. Global political and social implications. What we're looking at here and thinking about is that some of our technology is made in other countries, or other components of the technology being assembled comes from other countries. For example, when you think about maybe an iPhone in your pocket, you may have components that come from Germany, from China, from wherever around the world. Something that is going on in those countries, say if there's political unrest or some type of other social implication, may have an impact on getting those components and being able to make this infrastructure secure. Lastly, cyber is another risk. Again, I don't think we can stress enough. I think everyone's pretty well aware that cyber continues to be kind of the growing threat when it comes to critical infrastructure as well as just society in general, and we will cover that a little bit later as well. So the chemical sector. The chemical sector includes everything from places that are producing and turning these raw materials into these 70,000 diverse products to even warehouses and things of that nature. I think that the explosion in Beirut is a really good example of understanding that, it may not be the actual plants that are processing these chemicals, but the places that are storing them may also be considered critical infrastructure and something that you want to be aware of within your community. The chemical sector contributes around 25% of the U.S. GDP and employs 800,000 workers. So again, we're talking about a large sector of society that is working within critical infrastructure. Major risks include insider threat. Of course, insider threat is when employees become disgruntled or get associated with bad actors and are trying to cause harm from the inside of your company. Cyber threats, again, we'll touch on it a bit later, but is a major concern. Natural disasters and extreme weather, again, we covered it very well in the last presentation, but flooding, hurricanes, all those major weather disasters are going to have an impact on the sector. Deliberate attacks and terrorism, again, thinking about bad actors breaking in, causing harm, or kind of tying that into cyber attacks as well. It can be a direct threat like that. And then, of course, biohazards and pandemics, which by now, I think with pandemics, we are all kind of familiar with how it's impacting society. So critical manufacturing, again, we're talking about manufacturing a wide variety of things when it comes to whatever it may be and contribute to society. The critical manufacturing sector is often kind of that backbone that is producing raw materials into goods that most Americans are consuming or using. It contributes to over $2 trillion in the U.S. economy, which represents about 12.5% of the U.S. GDP. Major risks to this sector include the natural disasters and extreme weather, supply chain disruptions, which again, we'll touch upon a little later. Global political and social implications, again, going back to the communication sector, what's happening in one country could impact what's being built here. Deliberate attacks and terrorism, and cyber, of course. So commercial facilities, and again, we got good old Fenway Park here for everyone that's a Red Sox fan. I know it's a tough year to be a Red Sox fan, but hopefully there's next year for us. Subsectors within this sector include everything from entertainment and media, think production sets, Hollywood, that type of thing. Gaming, where it's casinos, lodging, hotels, outdoor events, including everything from amusement parks to outdoor concert venues, public assembly places, which again can kind of tie into that concert venue as well, but also things like movie theaters, real estate, talking about office complexes and large apartments, and then retail, talking about malls and things of that nature. And of course, finally, the subsector of sports leagues, which includes Fenway Park and all of our athletic facilities around the country. And again, when we talk about protecting assets and special events and planning and kind of tying that back into Rich's presentation, when we think about special event planning for things like the Super Bowl, there's a lot that goes into the planning of that. And then that's why we pay close attention, because they're large places where people often gather. Some of the characteristics of the commercial facilities sector includes often these places being soft targets in crowded places, often very open, which makes them a very nice target for bad actors, unfortunately. Some of the risks associated with this sector include natural disasters and extreme weather, armed attacker due to their openness and being of soft targets. Talk about pandemics. Obviously, I think this one is also very evident with what's going on. A lot of these places may not be in operation or are in operation in a very limited capacity due to the pandemic. Cyber attacks, explosive devices, CBRN type responses, chemical, biological, radiological. Mass protests also have an impact. Theft being a vital component. And then UAS, which is things like drones. This is becoming a growing concern for the protection of assets. The ability for people to fly and drop a potential payload from a long distance away makes this, again, a very high concern from the protection standpoint. Supply chain, which again we'll touch on later, and then global political and social implications as well. So the dam sector, there are roughly 100,000 dams in the US. 31% of them have a high or significant hazard potential if they fail to operate. This means about, every 1 out of 3 dams you pass, if something happens to that dam, it's probably going to have some very large consequences for their surrounding neighborhoods. And again, thinking about the dam sector, it doesn't just include dams, it does also include our levees. And there's an estimated 100,000 miles of levees in the US, and 43% of the US population live by levees that reduce the risk of flooding. Risks to this one include natural disasters and extreme weather, erosion and structural issues, and I'll pair that together with aging infrastructure. When we think about kind of infrastructure throughout the country, I think a lot of people are very in tune when we think about things like bridges, roads. There's always concern that as they age, they begin to crack, they begin to crumble, and ultimately, I think there's continual talks about people wanting to update these, but ultimately it comes down to the economic factors of this. But there is that concern where erosion and structural issues will begin to occur, and they ultimately could lead to failure. We talked about also an aging workforce. So one of the major concerns around critical infrastructure is that a lot of the people that are operating this are tending to be a little bit older, which raises some concerns. Again, when we think about things like the pandemic, which again adversely is affecting older people potentially, and then thinking about, even as time goes on and as people begin to retire, if there's not interest in them, well, then we're going to have kind of a tough situation on our hands. Cyber attacks, again, as more components of infrastructure go online, it's representing more vulnerabilities when it comes to cyber attacks. So when we talk about industrial control systems and SCADA systems that are really kind of the backbone of some of these systems, all of those points are a different vulnerability for a bad actor to get in. So there is that increased focus on cyber attacks. And then, of course, deliberate attacks and terrorism. And again, I know this is 16 sectors and it may be a little painful, but I feel it's important to get through, so we will keep cruising. So the defense industrial base, I won't waste too much time on this because this one is very similar to the critical manufacturing sector. The risks included, a lot of the dependencies included are very similar. The only difference in this one is that a lot of these manufacturing facilities or R&D facilities are very focused on things that promote our nation's defense. So think ships, planes, ammunition, etc. All those components that might fall under the Department of Defense. And again, very similar critical manufacturing faces kind of the same threats. So that is that. So emergency services sector, which I feel probably a lot of us on this call will probably fall into, but there are more than 2.5 million career and volunteer people who serve within the emergency services sector, and how they do it is they break it up into 5 disciplines. These include law enforcement, emergency management, fire rescue, EMS, and public works, which I know we've been getting a question about public works, and I think it's great to see because often I feel sometimes that it's overlooked as a vital component. So again, risks include to this as cyber. When we think about, I think law enforcement is a great example. Much of what they do utilizes computer-aided dispatch systems, record management systems, and those are vulnerable to cyber attack. And when it happens, you're then kind of offline. I think it's very tough now to go back to kind of the paper copies of things. We've gotten so used to technology that cyber presents that large risk that we are reliant on it. Natural disasters and extreme weather, of course, when we think about those, has a large impact on all these sectors. Violent extremists and terrorist attacks, obviously always a concern when it comes to this. Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear incidents, also a major component of this when we think about hazmat response and interacting with some of these materials. So the energy sector. So energy sector is, again, another lifeline sector. It is one that there is a large focus on because it is kind of that backbone of power for our nation. It powers everything. I'm imagining, it's probably powering our computers right now. As we give this presentation, it's really being able to allow us to make this happen. But it does include everything from electricity, oil, and natural gas. This is one that, again, when we talk about one that faces that high risk, cybersecurity is a big focus for this sector. Nationwide, I think we're seeing some concerns and some themes of people targeting our energy sector for adversarial advantage. But of course, physical security and resilience, also a major component. Natural disasters and extreme weather conditions. When we think about, large snowstorm and power lines going down, those are all vital components to this sector. Aging workforce and human errors, again, another major concern there with the aging workforce, as well as aging infrastructure, which we touched upon with dams. It's a concern here. Regulatory and legislative changes, with energy, it's a heavily regulated industry. We're very, cautious of how we're proceeding, and that is something that creates changes and may create, economic impacts for the private sector when it comes to the energy sector. And then again, political instability, civil unrest, or terrorist activities also contribute to a risk for the energy sector. So financial services sector, this includes everything from our banks to, deposit, consumer credit, and payment system products, investment products, risk transfer products. Anything that has to do with money is basically covered under the financial services sector. It's a backbone kind of to a lot of different industries. When you talk about 85% or so of our infrastructure being privately owned, a lot of them are doing business, that means. And they're very tied to the financial services sector and making use of it to, operate day-to-day business. Risks include physical, cyber, and natural disasters, which is usually what most risks fall into for buckets. And that is kind of financial services. Government facilities. This is another sector that is very kind of wide and spanning and covers a lot of different things when it comes down to it. So we're talking everything from offices to educational facilities, monuments, research and development facilities, even our storage facilities for weapons and ammo. And there's so much more that really falls into this sector. It's kind of a very expansive one that probably could be narrowed down a little bit more, in my personal opinion, but it is very expansive and covers a lot of things. Key risks include man-made threats, when it comes to government facilities and government, and kind of see what's going on in society today with some political unrest. We can sort of see that man-made threat is present. Natural threats, of course, pandemics being a major component. Don't need to talk more about that. Aging infrastructure, just in general. Again, when we talk about the crumbling of infrastructure over time, we want to make sure that we're keeping these up to date. And then, of course, cyber threats. So the food and agriculture sector, this is one that I feel is very important as it comes to feeding our nation and making sure that we have dinner on our plates at night. It accounts for roughly 1/5 of our nation's economic activity. And in 2014, there's more than 935 100,000 restaurants and institutional food services, an estimated 114,000 grocery outlets, and 2.1 million farms totaling over 900 million acres of land. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about a sector that's very expansive, but also very at risk. You know, when we talk about things like salmonella and those types of things, you know, one small contamination could lead to a much larger outbreak. So again, it's something we want to pay attention to. We want to be able to track and make sure that we're putting proper protection in place to be able to track those things, as well as keep food safe. When we talk about kind of trust in government and trust in society, we want to make sure that people do feel comfortable eating the food that they are eating, as it is vital to human life. Risks to this sector include food contamination and disruption, which I momentarily just talked about, disease and pests, severe weather, and cybersecurity. Again, with severe weather, I think we can see the wildfires and what's going on, a lot of what's burning down. We think about some of these wineries and things of that nature, all fall under this sector. So nuclear reactors, materials, and waste sector, I think this one is generally pretty self-explanatory when it comes down to it. We're talking about everything in relations to nuclear energy. So it includes 99 commercial nuclear power plants at 61 different sites, 18 decommissioning reactors, 31 non-power reactors, and many other small-sized facilities. Risks to this include natural disasters and extreme weather, structural issues, aging infrastructure and workforce, deliberate attacks and terrorism, cyber attacks, supply chain again, and mishandling of materials. When we think about this one, we can think about Fukushima and what happened, Fukushima Daiichi, and kind of, you know, one natural event can cause a catastrophic consequence for another type of facility. And I think that's very evident with this sector when we're talking about nuclear energy. And I think that's where a lot of concerns around nuclear energy come from. So water and wastewater sector, this is another one of our lifeline sectors. Of course, we need water as human beings, but we also need clean water to consume, and we don't want to be getting sick from the water we are drinking. So just as an overview, there are 153,000 public water systems in the US and more than 16,500 water treatment plants. This also encompasses everything that it takes basically to get water to your faucet, potentially. So that kind of transportation aspect of the sector as well. Risks to this include natural disasters, aging infrastructure, cyber events, and area-wide events. Again, when we talk about cyber events, focusing on that ICS SCADA component of it is very prominent. A lot of these systems in this sector do rely on kind of technology to do the job for them. We're almost there, folks. Information technology, this is again an expanding sector. It does not necessarily have a finite amount and easily identifiable amount of physical assets. This is very much things that take place in the virtual world and ties back into that definition where we're talking about physical or virtual assets. This sector includes everything from our research development facilities, distribution, as well as upgrades and maintenance facilities. So we're talking about all the different components that go into making our information technology assets very strong. Risk to this obviously includes cyber, that is a big component of it, supply chain, insider threat, and natural disasters. When we talk about the supply chain, it kind of ties into that political unrest as well, as you know, something in one country can impact what we're putting together here. So the transportation sector, this is another lifeline sector, and this is a very expansive one. It covers many different subsectors. So all these different subsectors that compose it, you know, we're thinking everything from aviation, like our Bennington Airport, maritime, we think about, you know, our little Coast Guard base on Lake Champlain, freight rail, when we're talking about moving goods through the country, our highways, our pipelines, our postal and shipping, as well as our mass transit systems. So in 2013, 9.3% of US GDP was supported by this sector, and approximately 6% of the entire population of the US works within it. And I think a major component of this is thinking about the movement of goods and services, which is a vital component to, you know, getting one product from one place to your refrigerator, for example. And approximately 19.6 billion tons of goods were shipped in 2014. Risks include terrorism, aging infrastructure, natural disasters, and extreme weather events, just to name a few. And again, it is a lifeline sector, so every other sector is very dependent on this sector. And finally, I believe this should be number 16, so we're almost there. Healthcare and public health sector. Again, this one highlighted by the pandemic, the importance of this sector within our society. So in 2011, Americans made 262 million visits to hospitals or outpatient departments, and almost 50% of Americans require one or more prescription medications. So when we think about that, we're thinking about all the different assets that go into those components. So it is our hospitals, but it's also things like our long-term care facilities, our manufacturers that are making medications and things of that nature. It also includes things like our information technology that goes into the healthcare industry, as well as our mass fatality management services. Risks to this include pandemics, natural disasters, terrorism or active attacker, supply chain, and cyber attacks. Cyber attacks within the healthcare sector is another thing that appears to be growing pretty fast. Again, when we think about bad actors being able to hack in and potentially gain access to someone's medical records, that's very sensitive data that we don't want the bad actors to have. So we need to put forth an effort to protect that data. And I wasn't wrong, we made it through. So there we go, we made it through 16 sectors. Now we can get into a little bit more of the fun stuff, hopefully. So we're talking about threats and hazards. We went through a lot of different risks, and those are kind of the threats and hazards within each, but most are falling into the three buckets. So physical, we're talking about man-made threats when we're talking about whether it be explosive materials, an active attacker, or something to that nature. There's also natural threats, which was covered in the last presentation. We're talking about extreme weather. You know, Vermont might be the floods, it could be the snow. Those are important factors when it comes to the threats and hazards that critical infrastructure assets face. And then finally, the third being cyber. Cyber is that growing one. Again, can't stress it enough. You know, as technology continues to expand, we're seeing billions and billions of devices going online. And all those connections just represent an additional vulnerability that can be exploited by bad actors. These are kind of just an overview, kind of a larger scale of all the different types of threats and hazards that the infrastructure industry faces. I will point to two just out of this list, and it's the last two on the right. So foreign influence operations, and what we're talking about here is kind of election security becoming a vital component to critical infrastructure. So when we think about 2016 and foreign influence, I think most people are very familiar with what was going on. So that is a threat and hazard when it comes to the infrastructure industry. And then additionally, untrusted investment being another area. So again, we have growing national security concerns over investments in companies like Huawei and ZTE into our kind of 5G technology aspect. So we just want to make sure that we're investing in companies and technology that are, again, going into our critical infrastructure, being the backbone of our society, that really are trustworthy by the people, and people can put their trust in it, that, you know, whether it be their data or whatever it may be, is being shared only with the appropriate people. So now what I'm going to do is kind of jump into some mini case studies, and we're going to focus on first some events from yesterday, as I like to call it, and hopefully I'm going to point out a couple things that I comes to things you can consider, and kind of places to start when thinking about critical infrastructure within your community. And again, I will summarize them all at the end, but I'm hoping that these events kind of present an aspect that makes you think that, you know, infrastructure has been around for a while. It's not going anywhere. It's going to continue to be here. So there are some small steps that we could take today to begin to protect our communities all that much better. And here we go. This is our little dream sequence. That was our time traveling back in time. And we're traveling all the way back to 1777 and the Battle of Bennington. You may be wondering, you know, what does this have to do with critical infrastructure back in 1777? But it turns out it has a lot of lessons that I think we can take from it. So again, for those who aren't totally familiar, the Battle of Bennington took place in 1777. It technically took place in neighboring New York, but the strategic objective for the enemy was to confiscate horses and supplies stored in Bennington, Vermont. Thankfully, the good guys won. It was a turning point in the American Revolution, and, you know, the rest is history. We celebrate Bennington Battle Day every year as Vermonters. But what can we think about, and what can we take away from this that relates to critical infrastructure? Well, I'd like to hone in on 2 points. So one being, infrastructure is an attractive adversarial target. So the enemy was very aware of the supplies, where they were stored in Bennington, and wanted to gain them for military advantage. And this hasn't really changed today. Maybe the abundance and style of it has changed a little bit, but our enemies are still very focused on being able to get into our infrastructure and being able to kind of impact that society. And again, this was during wartime, Battle of Bennington being, but when we think about it, these 16 sectors are constantly kind of under attack and are managing the different threats and hazards that they face. So that's kind of key takeaway one, that it is an attractive adversarial target. People are thinking about it when it comes to the military. And when it comes to time of war, that's a good target to attack because it has such a large, important impact on society. And the other thing I will hone in on this one is assets identified are assets protected, which sounds very elementary, very basic, but it is a vital component to protecting our critical infrastructure. So when we think about the critical infrastructure kind of risk management style, it all starts with, setting goals and objectives that say whatever you want to do within your plan. And then one of those next components is being able to identify critical infrastructure. And I will say that, this does sound simple, that once you identify them, they're protected. But if you don't identify them, they're not protected. The reality is that if we weren't aware of the horses and supplies in Bennington, the enemy very well could have taken it, and that could have been a turning point for the bad guys in the war. So it is a vital component of identifying assets within your community so that we can begin to understand what we need to do to protect them. Just relating to this, some modern day threats when we think about cyber and being kind of that adversarial target. When we think about the Stuxnet attack, which again was attacking Iranian nuclear facilities, was a cyber component and was able to kind of have a cyber physical component where it started with the cyber attack and then kind of shut down actual physical damage to this to the plants. That is a very vital component and very similar to this. And obviously the physical threat it is there as well. So now we will time travel a little bit forward to 1927 and the 1927 flood. So again, I think a lot of people are very familiar with this, especially once Irene hit. I think these are very kind of talked together when it comes to it. But for those who don't know, again, it occurred in November 1927. It had a large impact when we're talking about infrastructure when it comes to it. So, over 1,200 bridges lost throughout the state, 23 manufacturing plants lost, totaling $2.8 million. So when we're talking about kind of the full spectrum of one event impacting so many different sectors, this is a great example. And now, besides those general things of what we can take away of, building infrastructure that's really resilient, there's also this component of risk management as a mindset. So I was doing some research into this event, and it turns out, and again, I can only confirm from my research, it was a trustworthy source, but there was apparently 2 companies in Montpelier that had flood insurance when this happened. So when we think about that, being able to mitigate the risk from floods, that is a valuable component. And they probably were a little bit better off than the other maybe 21 manufacturing plants that could have been there. So when we're thinking about risk management when it comes to critical infrastructure, what we're really talking about is kind of that first component that Rich was talking about earlier, when we're kind of charting out, what are our threats and hazards, where are they, what are the consequences, which ones are going to be low, medium, and high consequence if they happen. And we're talking about the vulnerability. So what's the likelihood that a flood's going to happen or an active attacker is going to happen, and what can we do? And then we're talking about, which also ties into about kind of the threat of it, which is that likelihood of the event happening as well. When we talk about vulnerabilities, there's great tools out there, great resources out there that I'll talk about a little later, where you can focus on getting a vulnerability assessment done on your facility that will really highlight sort of things that you can do to make your facility a little bit more secure when it comes to kind of the physical security side of things. So then again, we will time travel forward to the Northeast blackout of 1965. For those who don't know, this was a not super long-term, but long enough term blackout that impacted a large portion of the Northeast. So it occurred November 9th, 1965. It was about rush hour in New York City, as you can imagine. If you want a great look, there's a lot of information about what New York City was like in that. We're talking about New York City having to call in the National Guard, extra law enforcement to prevent looting and things of that nature. So when we think about kind of that threat of a blackout, those things are very possible. It did impact 8 U.S. states and as well as Canada. And given 1965, one of the major components of this was that many people were reacting and weren't sure what was actually going on, and there was concerns, given it was kind of during that Cold War period, that this may be kind of a foreign operation. So there was that concern. So what can we take away from this? Well, we can look about and talk about the connectedness between assets. So one event, and what ended up happening was a fault line in Ontario kind of tripped, and then everything kind of got backed up and overloaded, and that's what led to the blackout. So when we think about that, when we think about an event happening in Ontario, Canada, that basically shut down power for their whole Northeast, it really highlights how connected these sectors are and connected we are as a society. Now, this is kind of one component where we think about connectedness just between the energy sector causing a long-term blackout, but because that happens, there's also the connectedness between sectors, which can cause cascading effects. So if you lose power, you may lose power to your wastewater treatment plant or your water plants, and then you're going to have a public health issue on your hands. So we want to begin to think about kind of the connectedness between assets within our community and how they interact. The other component to this is information sharing is vital. Had that information that it was kind of just a faulty line that happened, got spread a little faster and a little quicker, the kind of rumors and myths about the Cold War aspect of it could have been dispelled much quicker. And I think that that's a very valuable component when it comes down to this. So fast forwarding to 2001, we can talk about mad cow disease. So again, mad cow disease was really something that impacted Europe, but it did eventually make its way to Vermont in 2001, where it did affect some of our livestock, which ended up having to be taken away. But what can this kind of teach us? And I think this is a very valid point that people may not always think about, is that this, in my opinion, is one of those kind of asymmetric threats, right? This was in essence, we had a lot of bit of research about it. We knew what was going on in Europe, but at the same time, it's not something I think people would typically think about today, which is, one small aspect to, say, maple syrup today could have a large impact on the economics of Vermont and the maple syrup industry. If one's tampered with, people lose trust in Vermont maple syrup, and then we're having economic impacts that come from that. And I think that this kind of highlights that asymmetric threat. And also, it just shows the global connectedness of all this. I think there are very vital components to our infrastructure that are so tied to things going on around the globe that it's very important to understand what's going on kind of at all times and kind of be in tune of what's going on in other areas through the world to be able to know how it's going to impact us here at home. So wrapping up, just reviewing some of these lessons from the past. So again, infrastructure assets are attractive targets for bad actors, and that's why we want to protect them, because ultimately they're the backbone of our society. They make our lives much easier and allow us to kind of carry out our day-to-day activities. Big takeaway, and if it's one thing I can say that you can take away from today, is just identify assets within your community. I think there's a lot to learn because there's 16 sectors and they're very diverse and include a lot of things. But if you can begin to identify these assets within your community, we can better protect against whatever may occur, and we can kind of mitigate some of these risks if possible through this. Adopt a risk management mindset when drafting plans. Of course, I think most people probably do this and are thinking about the different threats and hazards when developing all emergency operations plans, but it's something I throw in there. Consider the interconnectedness, dependencies, and interdependencies between sectors. So I kind of skipped over this just for the sake of time when I was going through the sectors, but this component of dependencies and interdependencies basically means, wastewater treatment plants are reliant on the energy sector to power some of the technology in there. And these kind of go back and forth where, the energy sector may need water to cool some of their systems to produce energy. So throughout all 16 sectors, some are very dependent on each other, some are interdependent on each other, and it's important to understand within our communities which ones these are so that we know if, a fire happens, it is knocked down a couple power lines, well, it also may have these cascading effects. And when we can begin to think about that and think about all those connections, we can begin to realize where our true risk is and what we really want to protect. So again, think about connectedness beyond your community. It's great to think about all those connections in your community. There's also a good chance that everything feeding into your community is also connected to the greater outside world. So it's important to consider those as well. And then consider information sharing channels. And this goes few and far between. You know, connect with your local critical infrastructure assets, talk to them, introduce yourself. As a public safety professional, you know, you do bring value to their table when it comes to these types of things. And then finally, I throw out think creatively. I think this is an important aspect when we're talking about any type of protection with critical infrastructure or anything thereof. You know, we talk about 9/11 and the 9/11 Commission report. One of the things identified was failures of imagination, and that does not change today. We have bad actors out there thinking creatively about how they can cause us harm, so we need to be thinking creatively as well, putting on our bad guy hats, and we can begin to, you know, really draft out what those threats and hazards may be. And we'll touch kind of upon this when we're talking about some of our future threats of what may face the critical infrastructure industry. I know I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to breeze through this next part because, quite frankly, these are very talked about, and I think everyone will be very familiar with them. So talking about events of today, Tropical Storm Irene, what do I point out from this? Well, it's the impact a single event can have on all critical infrastructure sectors. It had a large impact across the board on many different aspects. And when we talk about consequence with economic, public health, and safety impacts, those were very evident from Tropical Storm Irene. COVID-19, what can we learn about this as well? Well, I think this highlights the importance of identifying assets. We want to be able to understand, you know, what are those critical components? Who are the people that really need to be going into the office to do their job to make sure that society can continue to push forward? And I think that's really what, you know, this whole pandemic has really highlighted from a critical infrastructure perspective. So just areas of concern today are natural hazards, of course, flooding, snowstorms, and drought being one. Cyber hazards, you know, we talked about Stuxnet with a cyber physical aspect. That's an important one. Ransomware, we continue to see, you know, ransomware being a vital component that's affecting local governments. So it's definitely something to be considering. Physical threats like active attackers and other areas of soft targets and crowded places. We talked about the Audi Ski Cup. That's a great example of just a soft target and crowded places. And Rich touched upon all the planning that goes into that. So addressing CI today, things you can do: identify your assets, build those relationships, and share that information both ways. And I'll give some tips here and resources that allow you to do that. But first, just looking quickly over what may be in the future. So 5G and cybersecurity is a big component. 5G is going to create way more connections and way more Internet of Things, IoT devices that are going to be connected to the internet. You can think about your home. Maybe you have a Ring doorbell or anything like that. All those represent, again, another vulnerability that can be exploited. And when it comes to, you know, infrastructure sectors, they are still utilizing technology to do much of their business. And that is a vital component when we talk about kind of the supply chain of everything. So supply chain, what we're talking about here. I think the best example of this is the Maersk shipping case. Basically, one of the largest global movers of goods got hacked. And then ultimately, when their boats were arriving in our ports, the records of what was on those boats was wiped. So you had a lot of mad truckers who could not leave the ports because they were vulnerable. And that kind of shows the supply chain aspect of it and how vulnerable it is. But it also highlights, you know, the supply chain within our society works on a very tight window. We're talking about quick turnaround times and small windows of opportunity. So a small disruption can have a large impact on the larger supply chain. Information warfare, when we're talking about things like elections of 2016, drones, climate change being a big impact, infectious diseases, of course. I just want to quickly breeze through some resources, and we'll have the few minutes to go over to the chat room. So guiding documents and directives you can learn more with. NIP 2013, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, outlines everything you can really provide with critical infrastructure protection. It outlines a risk management framework, kind of the small activities that you can take that can help your community. And Presidential Policy Directive 21 feeds into that as well. Also, for each sector, there's also a sector-specific plan, which really gets into the specifics of how you can work with each sector to do these protection initiatives. So I'll give a shout out to the federal side with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, formerly the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Each state is assigned a protective security advisor, and they, as an organization, are really focused on being the nation's risk management agency. And I will say that they are putting out some great resources. They have some great offerings that they bring to the table, and you can learn more at the website there. They just released not too long ago kind of a pamphlet of all the different services that you can have, whether you're a government agency, a private sector business, or kind of that local government. As well as on our website at hsu.vermont.gov, we've just recently updated with a critical infrastructure page. We have some great, independent study courses you can go take, as well as a walkthrough of a course that we are currently doing. Again, we are currently focusing on identifying assets statewide throughout Vermont, and we are working with our team at iParametrics, and they have developed a course with us to kind of walk you through everything and all the basics you need to know about critical infrastructure. And the two last things I will point out is just the IP Gateway and the PCII program. So these are two tools for interacting with the private sector. One of the things about critical infrastructure is I say all, but most of it is owned by the private sector and not the government. So information is vital and is key and not necessarily always welcome to be shared. And these two provide ways that we can do this. So the IP Gateway is really just a portal for coordinating with critical infrastructure. It includes some resources, risk assessments, as well as GIS mapping tools. There are several steps you have to go through to get access, but it does provide some great resources for securing infrastructure. Now, the PCII program is just a method of sharing information between the private sector and public sector. So I think about this in the easiest terms of, as a kid growing up, you may have had a spare key outside your house, and you wouldn't tell people where that spare key was. But if you lost a spare key, you may tell your parents that you lost it because it's vital information for them to know that it's missing. And I think that's kind of how I look at this, is that, there's information the private sector does not want to share with a wider audience because it could cause them harm, but we want them to share it with us because it might be vital information for wider society that we can work to, bring protection, bring a better response to. So information submitted under the PCII program is protected from FOIA, state and local sunshine laws, use in regulatory actions, and use in civil litigation. Again, it's all voluntarily shared information, but it really does help to promote protection and response activities. So just some key takeaways to review. Consider and identify infrastructure in your community and how you can involve them in your plans. Consider those economic, public health, and safety and security impacts. Build relationships and information sharing channels. Explore the guiding documents, the sector-specific plan, NIP 2013, and really learn what's happening at the federal and state level and how it could impact your smaller communities. And then, again, think creatively and continue to expand that education. Read up on those documents. Again, I don't necessarily think critical infrastructure is going anywhere, but it's such a big topic. Again, each sector just represents a vital component of society, and there's so much information out there that you can consume and learn about and consider when building plans within your community. So with that, that is my information, and I know I've gone a little long, but I open it up and give it back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that information-packed session.